Take a look at this canyon. In March of 1928, a 200-foot concrete dam stood at the narrow point of this valley in the mountains north of Los Angeles, holding back more than 12 billion gallons of water. On the morning of March 12th, the man responsible for watching over it noticed muddy water leaking near the western abutment, and it worried him enough that he picked up the phone and called one of the most powerful water engineers in California. Before dawn, hundreds of people downstream would be dead. And although the events in this video are described without graphic detail, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. San Francisco Canyon sits in the mountains about 40 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. In the 1920s, it was a quiet place of ranches, work camps, and scattered homes strung along a creek, and almost nobody outside the water business had any reason to think about it. But the canyon mattered enormously to one man, William Mulholland. In Los Angeles, Mulholland was practically civic mythology, an Irish immigrant who had risen from ditch digger to chief engineer of the city's water system and built the 233-mile aqueduct that carried water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. That aqueduct made the modern city possible, and it made Mulholland one of the most trusted public figures in the state. But the aqueduct had enemies. Farmers in the Owens Valley, watching their water disappear south, had begun dynamiting sections of it in protest. Los Angeles needed a reserve, somewhere close to the city that could hold enough water to keep it alive for a year if the aqueduct was cut. So Mulholland chose San Francisco Canyon, and between 1924 and 1926, his bureau built the St. Francis Dam. It was a curved concrete gravity dam, standing about 200 feet above the streambed, and when its reservoir filled, it held roughly 38,000 acre-feet of water. That is more than 12 billion gallons. Almost from the beginning, the dam leaked. Now, to be fair, most large concrete dams of that era leaked somewhere, and engineers of the time considered a certain amount of clear seepage normal. But cracks appeared as the structure cured, and as the reservoir rose through 1927 and early 1928, new leaks kept showing up. The man whose job it was to monitor all of this was the dam keeper, Tony Harnischfeger. He lived in a cottage in the canyon just downstream of the dam, with his 6-year-old son, Coder, and his girlfriend, Leona Johnson. Tony knew the structure as well as anyone alive, and by early March of 1928, with the reservoir just inches from full for the first time, he did not like what he was seeing. On the morning of March 12th, Tony found a new leak near the western abutment, where the concrete met the canyon wall. What alarmed him was the color. The water running out was brown, and brown water can mean the flow is eroding the foundation material underneath the dam. He called Mulholland's office, and Mulholland took the report seriously enough to drive out himself that same morning along with his deputy, Harvey Van Norman. The two men spent about 2 hours at the site. When they examined the leak, they found that the water was picking up its muddy color from loose soil where it ran across the ground, and that where it actually emerged, it appeared to be running clear. Mulholland judged the seepage normal for a dam of that size, and by early afternoon, the two men drove back to Los Angeles. Whether the warning sign had been misread or the real failure was already beginning somewhere else in the foundation, the dam stood through the afternoon and into the evening. A motorcyclist who passed on the canyon road later that night described feeling something strange in the road and hearing sounds he could not place, but he kept going. Then, at 3 minutes before midnight, the St. Francis Dam failed. It did not fail slowly. Analysis of the wreckage indicates the structure broke apart within seconds, as enormous sections of concrete tipped and collapsed, and the entire reservoir began emptying into the canyon at once. The initial flood wave has been estimated at as much as 140 feet high. The dam keeper's cottage stood directly in its path. Tony Harnischfeger, little Coder, and Leona Johnson were almost certainly the first to die. Leona's body was later found wedged between blocks of concrete near the base of the ruined dam. Tony and his son were never found at all. About 1.5 miles downstream sat Powerhouse No. 2, a hydroelectric station with a small community of workers and their families living beside it, around 125 people in total. The flood reached them roughly 5 minutes after the collapse. The powerhouse was built of reinforced concrete, and the water tore it off its foundations. Only a tiny handful of the people living there survived, and one of them, a worker named Ray Rising, was carried out of his house by the water and lived by clinging to floating wreckage. His wife and 3 daughters did not. From there, the water turned west into the valley of the Santa Clara River, and it began a journey of 54 miles to the Pacific Ocean. Ahead of it lay ranches, work camps, and the towns of Castaic Junction, Fillmore, Santa Paula, and Satakoy. The wave slowed as the valley widened, but it remained a moving wall of water, mud, wrecked buildings, and uprooted orchards, in places 2 miles wide. At a construction camp near Castaic Junction, dozens of workers for Southern California Edison were sleeping in tents on the riverbank. The water reached them around 1:15 in the morning, and 84 of them died. What saved hundreds of others was the telephone. As word of the failure spread through utility and police switchboards, operators stayed at their posts in the middle of the night, ringing homes and businesses in the path of the flood. In Santa Paula, a 26-year-old operator named Louise Jipe kept placing calls even as the water approached her own town. Police officers went out to meet the wave directly. A motorcycle patrolman named Thornton Edwards rode street to street through Santa Paula with his siren open, pounding on doors, and he came to be remembered afterward as the Paul Revere of the disaster. Because of people like Gipp and Edwards, thousands got to high ground in time. The flood reached the ocean near Ventura around 5:30 in the morning, 5.5 hours after the collapse. Bodies were recovered from the debris for weeks, and some washed ashore as far south as the Mexican border. The official death toll was eventually set at around 431, but the true number is higher and will never be known with certainty. The Santa Clara Valley was full of migrant farm workers, many of them Mexican laborers living in camps that kept no records, and entire families simply vanished from the count. Modern researchers generally put the toll at somewhere above 450, making it one of the deadliest disasters in California history, and one of the worst civil engineering failures in American history. The coroner's inquest began just 9 days later, and Mulholland, then 72 years old, took the stand. He did not defend himself. He told the jury that he envied the dead, and when asked about responsibility, he said that if there had been an error in human judgment, he was the human, and that the blame should be fastened on him and no one else. The inquest found that the disaster was caused by the failure of the rock the dam was built on, and it placed responsibility on Mulholland's bureau while declining to charge him criminally, concluding that the geological problems could not have been detected by the standards of the era. Mulholland retired within months. He lived another 7 years, by most accounts a broken man. For decades, the accepted explanation focused on the western abutment, where the dam sat on a weak conglomerate rock that softened when wet. But in the 1990s, the engineering geologist J. David Rogers re-examined the failure and reached a different conclusion. According to his analysis, the eastern side of the canyon was an ancient landslide, a huge mass of broken schist that had slid long before anyone built anything there, and the rising reservoir reactivated it. In Rogers' reconstruction, the hillside began to move that night. The eastern end of the dam was pushed out, and the collapse followed from there. Under modern site investigation, the canyon would never have been approved. In 1928, no state law even required an independent review of Mulholland's design. That changed almost immediately. Within a year, California created state oversight of dams and began requiring the licensing of civil engineers, and the wreckage in San Francisco Canyon became one of the founding case studies of modern dam safety. The St. Francis Dam failed because of what was hidden in the rock beneath it. The next disaster is different, because in this one, the danger was identified years in advance, in writing, by name, and construction continued anyway. In the Dolomite Mountains of northeastern Italy, the Vajont River runs through a gorge so narrow and so deep that engineers had been eyeing it since the 1920s. A dam built there could be relatively thin and still hold back an enormous reservoir, and after the Second World War, with Italy rebuilding and hungry for electricity, a private power company called Sade decided to build it. The design came from Carlo Semenza, one of the most respected dam engineers in Europe, and what he planned was extraordinary: a concrete arch rising more than 850 feet from the bottom of the gorge. When it was completed in 1959, it was the tallest dam of its kind on Earth. As a piece of structural engineering, it was close to flawless. The real danger stood on the mountainside right beside it. The southern wall of the reservoir was a mountain called Monte, and the people who lived in the villages of Erto and Casso, on the slopes above the future lake, had never trusted it. In the local dialect, the mountain slopes had a reputation for being rotten, and residents spoke of it as the mountain that walks. Their families had farmed under it for generations, and they knew that it shed rockfalls and slumps in ways the surrounding peaks did not. When Sade began buying up land and the villagers protested, their objections were treated as the complaints of peasants standing in the way of progress. One person took them seriously. Tina Merlin was a journalist for the communist newspaper L'Unità, and beginning in the late 1950s, she wrote a series of articles warning that filling the reservoir under Monte risked destabilizing the mountainside above the towns. In 1959, after she reported on the danger and on Sade's treatment of the locals, she was criminally charged with spreading false and alarming news. She stood trial in Milan in 1960 and was acquitted, but her warnings changed nothing about the project. Then Monte started moving. The reservoir started filling in 1960, and as the water rose against the base of Monte the slope began to move. Carlo Semenza's own son, Eduardo, was a geologist, and during surveys of the valley, he had identified something his father's project could not afford to be true. The entire lower flank of Monte appeared to be an ancient landslide, a colossal mass that had detached in prehistoric times and was resting against the valley floor. Water seeping into the base of that mass would lubricate the old sliding surface. In November of 1960, a chunk of the slope, roughly 700,000 cubic meters, broke off and slid into the reservoir. Around the same time, a crack opened across the mountainside above it, running for more than a mile, in the shape of a giant letter M. It traced the outline of the mass that was preparing to move, and the engineers could see it from the dam. Then Sade made the decision that turned Vajont from a geological warning into a human disaster. Rather than abandon the reservoir, the company decided it could manage the landslide. The theory was that by raising and lowering the water level in controlled cycles, they could coax the slope into sliding slowly, a little at a time, into a lake that would remain usable. They even built a bypass tunnel so the reservoir would still function if the slide cut it in half. For 3 years, they raised the water and watched the mountain creep, lowered the water and watched it slow, and raised it again. Carlo Semenza died in 1961, and the project passed to his deputy, an engineer named Alberico Biadeni. Through 1963, the reservoir was pushed to its highest level yet, and the creep measurements on Monte climbed from millimeters per day to centimeters per day, and then to tens of centimeters per day. Animals grazing on the mountain reportedly refused to stay on it. In the final days, the company began lowering the water in an attempt to slow the slope back down, but this time, the mountain did not respond. On the night of October 9, 1963, engineers and technicians were at the dam monitoring the situation. Down the valley, in Longarone, people were in bars and homes, watching soccer and settling into an ordinary Wednesday night. At 39 minutes past 10, the entire measured mass of Monte roughly 260 million cubic meters of rock, a block roughly a mile and a half wide, let go at once. Instead of the slow creep the engineers had planned around, it accelerated to something on the order of 100 kilometers per hour and hit the reservoir in about 45 seconds. The reservoir held roughly 115 million cubic meters of water that night, and the landslide displaced most of it instantly. Part of the water was thrown up the far side of the valley, where it climbed more than 800 feet above the lake level and reached the lower edge of Casso. Another surge ran up the valley and drowned the lakeside hamlets near Urto, and a third mass of water, tens of millions of cubic meters of it, rose over the crest of the tallest dam of its kind in the world and dropped into the gorge on the other side. Longarone sat at the mouth of that gorge, on the far bank of the Piave River. The people there heard a sound that survivors compared to thunder or to jets passing low, and moments later, the wave came out of the mouth of the Vajont Gorge, compressed and accelerated by the narrow rock walls, driving a blast of air ahead of it that shattered windows before the water arrived. It struck Longarone at roughly 10:43, and in about 4 minutes the town ceased to exist. Where there had been a centuries-old community of stone buildings, a church, hotels, and a community of several thousand people, there was afterward a plain of gray mud and gravel in which almost nothing stood. The villages of Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Faye, strung along the river nearby, were destroyed with it. About 1,900 people died that night, most of them in and around Longarone, and hundreds of them were children. Some families were never recovered at all, and when the survivors and rescuers looked up the gorge in the morning light, they saw something almost impossible to process. The dam was still there. The wave had stripped away its crest railing and gatehouse, but the arch itself had withstood a force far beyond anything it was designed for, and it stands to this day, holding back a valley now half filled with the rock of Monte The structure never failed. Everything around the decision to fill it did. In the years that followed, an Italian court convicted Biadeni of manslaughter for his role in the disaster, though he served only a portion of a short sentence. Another senior engineer, Mario Pancini, died by suicide before the trial concluded. Tina Merlin, the reporter who had been prosecuted for warning about exactly this, spent years pushing for accountability and wrote a book about the valley that publishers refused to touch until 1983. And in 2008, at the launch of the United Nations International Year of Planet Earth, Vajont was cited as a textbook case of a disaster caused by the failure of engineers and geologists to act on what they knew. Vajont killed nearly 2,000 people, and the world eventually reckoned with it. The last disaster was different. Its death toll may have reached 6 figures, and for nearly 20 years, its true scale remained locked inside China's political and engineering bureaucracy. In the early 1950s, the new People's Republic of China launched a campaign to tame the Huai River Basin, a region of Henan province with a long history of catastrophic flooding. Dozens of dams went up in the space of a few years, and one of the largest was the Banqiao Dam on the Ru River, completed in 1952. It was an earthen embankment dam over 100 feet high, and like many projects of that era, it was built fast, by mass labor, under political pressure. Cracks appeared in the dam and its sluice gates almost immediately, so in the mid-1950s, it was reinforced and expanded with the help of Soviet engineers. Afterward, officials gave it a nickname that would age very badly. They called it the Iron Dam, a dam that could not break. One man in the provincial water bureaucracy refused to believe that. Chen Xing was one of China's leading hydrologists and had been involved in planning the reservoir system, and he argued that the entire basin was being overdammed, with too much emphasis on storing water and too little on letting floods escape. For Banqiao specifically, he recommended 12 sluice gates, so the reservoir could be drawn down quickly in an emergency. He was criticized as too conservative, and the design was cut to 5. When he continued to object to the direction of the program, he was denounced as a right-wing opportunist and removed from his position. The gates stayed at 5. For 20 years, nothing happened to test them, and then, in August of 1975, Typhoon Nina came ashore. The storm crossed Taiwan, entered the mainland, and then did something forecasters did not expect. It stalled over Henan when its remnants collided with a cold front, and it began to rain in a way that the region had never recorded before. Over 3 days beginning on August 5th, some weather stations measured more than 60 inches of rain. At one station near Banqiao, over 40 inches fell in a single 24-hour period, which was approximately the area's normal rainfall for an entire year, arriving in one day. Survivor accounts later described rain so violent it seemed to fall in ropes rather than drops. The Banqiao Reservoir had been designed around a maximum flood, calculated to occur once in 1,000 years. The rainfall of August 1975 roughly doubled it. By the night of August 7th, the reservoir was rising toward the crest of the dam, and the situation was already slipping out of anyone's control. Communications across the region were collapsing as the storm tore down telegraph and telephone lines, and requests and warnings between the dam, the county, and the provincial authorities were delayed, garbled, or never delivered at all. A request to fully open Banqiao's sluice gates earlier in the flood had reportedly been complicated by concerns about downstream flooding, and when the gates were opened, they could not release water anywhere near as fast as the storm was delivering it. Some accounts also indicate that silt had partially choked the sluices, reducing their capacity even further. The garrison at the dam tried to send emergency telegrams requesting airstrikes to blast open a spillway, and the messages did not get through in time. Just after midnight on August 8th, about 30 miles away, the Shimantan Dam on a neighboring river filled beyond its capacity and collapsed, releasing its entire reservoir in a matter of hours. At Banqiao, soldiers and workers were on top of the dam in the storm, trying to raise the crest with sandbags, when the water finally came over the top around 1 o'clock in the morning. An earthen dam cannot survive being overtopped. Flowing water strips the downstream face away until the structure fails. Survivors from the dam crew described the roar of the collapse, and one account records a worker shouting that the river dragon had come. In the hours that followed, dam after dam and dike after dike gave way downstream, as the flood wave hit each of them in sequence. By the time it was over, 62 dams had failed in a single night and day. Banqiao alone released hundreds of millions of cubic meters of water in around 6 hours, and it moved down the valley as a wave that witnesses and later reconstructions describe as several meters high, and in places more than 6 miles wide, traveling at roughly 30 miles per hour through the darkness. The people in its path had almost no warning of any kind. Entire communes were caught asleep. In Dawencheng, the commune was essentially annihilated, with reported deaths approaching 10,000 people. In Wencheng, roughly half the population died. Survivors described being carried for miles in the dark, and in the morning, the trees that remained standing were full of people who had climbed or been thrown into them, some of whom then waited days to be rescued. And the deaths did not stop when the water slowed. The flood spread across the plain and would not drain, in part because the region's own flood control dikes now trapped it. And in the days that followed, the military resorted to bombing and dynamiting other dams and embankments, simply to let the water out. Millions of people were left surrounded by contaminated water in the August heat, cut off from food and clean drinking water, while the People's Liberation Army tried to reach them by boat and airdrop. Disease and starvation moved through the flood zone for weeks. In total, the disaster struck a region of roughly 10 to 11 million people, and it destroyed millions of homes. How many died is still, half a century later, genuinely contested. A commonly cited official figure put the immediate deaths from flooding at about 26,000. A Human Rights Watch report in 1995, drawing on internal Chinese sources, put the full toll, including the famine and epidemics that followed, at somewhere between roughly 85,000 and 230,000. Figures as high as 240,000 have appeared in Chinese publications since. For decades, almost no one outside a small circle knew, because the entire event was treated as a state secret. There were no international headlines in 1975, no foreign aid, and no published casualty lists. The first detailed account to reach the outside world came largely through the Chinese hydrologist Yi Si, whose essay on the disaster appeared in the 1990s in a book of dissident writing on China's dams, edited by the journalist Dai Qing. In 2005, 30 years afterward, Chinese authorities partially declassified the event, and the country's own state media began openly reporting on what had happened in Henan. As for Chen Xing, the hydrologist who had asked for 12 gates and been purged for his caution, he was brought back after the catastrophe to help assess the wreckage of the very system he had warned about. The Banqiao Dam itself was eventually rebuilt in the 1990s and still stands on the Ru River today. Depending on which estimate is closest to the truth, the Banqiao disaster may be the deadliest dam failure ever recorded. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you want more stories about the disasters institutions tried hardest to bury, subscribing helps more than you think. I will see you in the next one.